And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again, and today we're going to be doing a vocabulary of comics video. And this is one that I've been putting off for a little while, partly because it's quite a big topic and it's been quite difficult to work out exactly how I was going to approach it. But at the same time, delaying the release of this video is going to be delaying the release of other reading orders and things that I want to release on the channel. So I just wanted to get it out of the way. That said, this is not going to be a perfect video. It's not going to cover absolutely everything, and I have no doubt that after I've published it and it's online in a few weeks' time, I'll think, oh, I should have added this or that or the other. But for now, let's just see how we get on. Today's topic in the vocabulary of comics is one of the most important ones and one of the most commonly requested ones that I get on my channel, which is explaining comics continuity. I get asked this a lot. I get asked all sorts of continuity related questions, what to read before X and what to read after Y. And I totally get why that's the case. I mean, my channel has a lot of comic book reading maps and reading guides on there. And so as a result, I want to touch on something that I referred to a few times and that I really first talked about in my introductory video to my DC New 52 series, where I talk about the two types of comic reader, the type P reader and the type J reader. I'm not going to explain why I picked those particular letters instead of A and B and 1 and 2. If anyone can work out what those two things are references to, then you will get a gold star and a free comic from me. But there are two types of readers, and as such, I think it's really important to understand that there is a spectrum of comic book readers when it comes to things like continuity and understanding reading guides. And type P readers are way at one end, and type J readers are at the other end. And most of us fall somewhere in between. And I think often when I talk about different types of comic book readers and different types of perspectives about comic book continuity, I do refer to type P and type J. And I wanted to put this video out there as just a handy guide for people to refer to when I talk about it more and more often in future videos. Before I dive into really defining what those two types of comic readers are at either end of the comic reading spectrum, I just want to talk just a bit about comics in general, and specifically about the real world of comics. It can be quite easy to forget that there is a real world behind the comics publishing world. When you look at Marvel Comics, we talk about the 616 universe, and you've got Daredevil in Hell's Kitchen, you've got Captain America working for S.H.I.E.L.D., and you've got the Fantastic Four in wherever they are at the moment, the Baxter Building or 4 Freedom Plaza or whatever. You have all those parts of the comic universe. But the thing is, and this is to be horribly, unremittingly bleak about it, but the truth is these are just comics. That's all they are. And they're made by human beings. And those human beings historically have all worked in offices in America, now increasingly are distributed across the world, but they're human beings with particular plans. And those human beings write stories, and those stories are drawn by other human beings, and then they're inked by other ones, and colored by other ones, lettered by other ones, and eventually they go through editorial. And it's worth keeping that in mind because I think what we need to keep in mind ultimately when we're thinking about continuity is the intent of the narrative experience. And by that, I mean the authorial intent of the narrative experience. When an author writes something, they expect people to read it in the sense that it's written. They will write one scene and then they'll write a subsequent scene, and they expect people to read it or in fact watch it or play it if we're talking about movies and video games in that same sequence in the sense that they're laying it out for the reader. So if someone writes issue 1 of a comic, they would generally expect that to be published before issue 2, and so someone would read that before issue 2. If they write issue 1, 2, and 3, they expect that to be read before issue 4, 5, and 6. So there may be certain Easter eggs and certain things in those first few issues that will be rewarded in later issues. What I'm talking about here is just simple chronology of creating something. Publishing something is quite different to creating something. Publishing comes due to editors, it comes due to publishing schedule, printing deadlines, things like that. And editors sometimes have overarching plans of how things are going to be made. So they might say, oh, we're going to have a crossover event which crosses between Superman and between Batman. Therefore, we need these issues to come out before these other issues. But the idea that editors are perfect and the idea that deadlines don't slip is just utterly ridiculous. I mean, the real world is the real world. Even taking COVID and things like that out of the mix, An author might intend something to be read a particular way. They might intend for issue 1 and 2 and 3 to come out in Superman before issue 4 comes out in a Batman comic. But that doesn't necessarily always happen. Things don't always necessarily join up in the real world. And that's because editorial aren't perfect. Looking at something like the New 52, the idea that editorial sat down on day one in DC and worked out exactly what the New 52 was going to be and exactly where everything touched base with everything else and where everything was perfectly consistent and continuous with everything else. That's just absolutely ludicrous. And you can go into YouTube and find dozens of videos talking about all the behind the scenes shenanigans that basically led to kind of a strange garbled mess and in some ways when it came to the DC New 52 and to DC Rebirth and to Marvel Legacy and to Marvel Secret Wars. There's always plans behind plans and wheels within wheels, and some editors have a massive overarching plan, other people don't. If you think about the X-Men era as it stands at the moment, what they call the Krakoa era, that was masterminded by Jonathan Hickman. But Jonathan Hickman left before he finished visualizing his vision, before he finished realizing it. And so as a result, we have other authors picking it up and taking it in different directions. Please don't think that there's a perfect overarching plan. And I guess this is the key part I want to take away at this beginning bit, which is that there is no overarching plan. There is no overarching perfect intention from someone sitting there at the start and going, right, for the next 20 years, this is the direction of comics, and this is what they're going to be. Comics are a soap opera created by different authors and different artists and different creators that all come in with their own agendas at different times, and different bits kind of go off in different ways, and the different bits get retconned and so on and so forth. There's a lot of terms I've just thrown out there, which it's kind of worth sort of diving into in a bit more detail because this is an ancillary point, which is actually quite key. I've talked about stuff like retcons and continuity and chronology, and even mentioned canon. So let's talk about all three of those things. I'll show you the dictionary definitions here, but let's talk about them in terms of comic book definitions. Continuity, in the term of comic books, is the idea of there being a shared universe. So, for example, while the Flash is going off doing something and fighting some of his villains, at the same time, within that same universe, whilst he's in Star City doing something, over in Metropolis, Superman is doing something, and in Gotham, Batman is doing something. That's the idea of continuity, that everything is kind of happening as part of a larger tapestry, all at the same time. That tapestry isn't perfectly defined. And generally speaking, there's a little bit of woolliness around it. You won't necessarily know if Batman issue 5, even if it comes out in the same issue of Superman issue 5, is it happening at exactly the same moment? Is it a day before? Is it a day after? Is it a month before or after? Are these flashbacks and so on? Generally, that's not too important when you're looking at continuity. What continuity means is that you have this large pot, like a cauldron of stories. You throw them in there, you mix them all in, and they're all kind of happening in a particular kind of general world. This is what's happening in a shared, consensually understood universe. That's fine if you're a Type J reader. The issue that comes in is with Type P readers, who are obsessed about something called chronology. Now, chronology is the idea of linear time, of events happening in a particular order where they succeed one after the other, and then there is a particular sequence. Moment one happens before moment two. Moment two happens before moment three. That's what chronology is, and Type P readers are obsessed with chronology, so we're going to talk about that more in just a second. But the last thing I want to touch on is the idea of canon. Canon is an abbreviation of a longer word, canonical. And what canonical or canon means is that this is something that it is considered to be part of the truth, the overarching approved narrative or history of a thing. The reason that's important is really when we're talking about stuff like multiverses. In comics, everything happens, and we don't even get me started on the Marvel multiverse. But the truth is, there are some things that are canon, and some things that aren't canon. So, if Wolverine ends up having uh, an entire family, ends up having kids, ends up having children, ends up having a Wolverine dog. That's just a Marvel multiverse story, the same way you get DC Elseworld stories. So it's not canon in the sense that it's not part of the central universe that we consider to be the central continuity of Marvel. So, just to dive into that for a second, Old Man Logan, which is a future story about the Marvel Universe. That is a particular story in a particular Marvel multiverse. Whether or not it's canon is a conversation for another time. So that's continuity, chronology, and canon kind of broadly explained. But what I really want to dive into is the one that really causes Type P readers to exist. And it's an obsession with this one thing that really pulls people away from what I perceive to be the fun part of comics and the enjoyment of comics into a strange kind of obsessive one-upmanship. And what I want to talk about is chronology. People that are obsessed with the chronology of a narrative essentially do not understand the concept of authorial intent, and they do not understand the concept of enjoying a narrative and enjoying narration and storytelling and exposition and twists and turns and all those sorts of things in the way that a writer or a creative person would understand it. I'm going to give you some examples just to kind of break down what we're talking about. Let's look at the movie Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction is a non-linear narrative. In Pulp Fiction, you have various events that happen before or after other events. Now, you could chop up Pulp Fiction and resequence all the scenes so they were just coherent individual scenes that all happen in a linear, coherent way. That would change the narrative thrust quite a lot. It'd make it, I'd imagine, a worse movie simply because you'd have things like the death of John Travolta's character, Vince Vega, you'd have that happening much later than what actually is the ending of the movie, which was the scene in the diner. In fact, Pulp Fiction as a whole as a movie is framed by one scene. It's the opening shot in the diner with Tim Roth and Honey Bunny, and then you got the end in the diner. And in between, you got all these other events. But actually, if you were to rejig the whole movie into linear chronological order and go, hey, this is the right continuity for the movie, you might enjoy watching that. That's fine. But that's not what Quentin Tarantino intended. And that wouldn't be a fun viewing experience. Let's take it a step further. Let's look at Unbreakable as a movie. Unbreakable came out 20 odd years ago, so I'm not going to give a spoiler warning for this. You should have seen it by now. But in Unbreakable, if you rejigged it and rejigged all the scenes, so the denouement at the end, the twist at the end, was actually something that we saw right at the beginning. If you put it in linear chronological order, I mean, that would suck. That would ruin the movie. That's not the authorial intent of what happens. Let's look at Star Trek. I mean, you watch Star Trek, and really it should be watched in order of release. So Star Trek, Next Generation, that overlaps a bit with DS9, which again overlaps with Voyager. Then you'd watch Enterprise. Then you'd move on to all the new ones, Picard and Brave New Worlds and all the various bits and pieces. But my point is, if you decide to watch it all in chronological order, you'd be watching Enterprise first. And the thing about watching something like that first is that quite often, watching something in the order of it being created and distributed allows you to enjoy foreshadowing in a way you wouldn't otherwise. In Enterprise, for example, don't really have they don't really have teleporters. At least in the first episode, they're not meant to. So it's meant to be, oh, this is exciting. Does this technology work or not? Obviously, we know it does work. We know where that road leads. But it's interesting to go back and see where these things came from. I guess a better example is Star Wars. Star Wars is episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But the truth is, you really want to watch them in the order they were released. If you watch episodes 1, 2, and 3, yeah, that's interesting if you're a fan of the prequel series. Personally, I'm not a huge Star Wars fan at all, but you could watch it in that order. But I think the reason that episodes 1, 2, and 3 got made, the reason they were interesting, the reason people were curious about them is because they'd watched 4, 5, and 6. And once you follow the story of Darth Vader and of Luke Skywalker, then you want to know what happened before it. I would argue the ideal viewing order for Star Wars is to watch episodes 4, 5, and 6, then to have a bit of a break, watch episodes 1, 2, and 3, and then come back and watch episodes 7, 8, and 9. Because that's the intention that the creators have. When they made episode 2 of Star Wars, back in 2000 and what 2003 2004 or something, when they made that, they weren't hoping, right, I hope people have only watched episode 1 and they watched episode 2, and I hope no one watches 4, 5, and 6 until we release episode 3 in a few years time. That's not the way it is. Those prequel movies were made with the full realization that people would have watched what was released in the real world before watching the prequels. Let's look at comics. Secret Invasion, which is something that's going to get a lot more traction over the next few years, no doubt, due to the MCU. Secret Invasion is a comic which has a couple of major twists and turns and revelations about Skrull imposters and who they really are and their identity and when they got switched out. And that works because it happens in the middle and at the end of the series. Lots of twists happen like that. But if you were to rejig these things, so that the things that happen chronologically first, so someone assuming someone else's identity or a secret betrayal or double cross and so on, if you rejig those so they're in chronological order, that's much less fun to read because that's not the authorial intent. I imagine you're into comics if you're watching my channel. So let's look at the MCU. If you took all the MCU movies for phase 1, 2, and 3, if you took all 23 movies and you splice them so they were in chronological order, keep in mind you'd be taking chunks out of Avengers Endgame and watching those chunks whilst we were in the end of phase 1. So for the original Avengers movie, because they're happening in New York at the same time. Can you imagine chopping and changing these things? And having scenes that were happening in the 1950s, which you would have to watch right at the beginning, even though they were in one of the very final films in the series. Following things in terms of the internal chronology is not a good way to enjoy a series. It's not a good way to enjoy the MCU. It's not a good way to enjoy Batman comics or Marvel comics or anything like that. No movie that is designed to have a twist and a turn, a revelation at the end, no heist movie, no murder mystery, none of these things benefit from people who are obsessed with seeing things in the correct chronology. It reminds me once of a thread I saw on Reddit where someone was talking about Watchmen, the 12-issue comic by Alan Moore. And they'd basically broken it down issue by issue, panel by panel, rejigging it so it was actually in clear chronological order. And this person was very much like, oh, well, when you read issue 3, you have to stop at page 2 and then go back to issue 1 and read panel 5 on page 7. And then you jump onto issue 4 and read. And it was kind of like that. And it was, I was reading this thread and I was like, dude, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, firstly, that's an incredibly annoying way to read a comic. Like, as a comic reader, you're constantly flipping back and forth, you're fiddling around. Secondly, Alan Moore definitely didn't want the comic to be read like that. By definition, that's not how it's meant to be consumed. And thirdly, and I think this is the most important thing about defining a type P reader, a type P reader is someone who wants to kind of impose reason and order upon their comics reading and their comics universe. It's someone who's looking for an overarching, perfect master plan and a perfectly constructed jigsaw where everything slots in together. And they're trying to impose order and sanity and chronological coherence upon a world which has none of those things. Because the comics world, as we said at the beginning, is created by humans. And so it's messy and it's confusing and it makes no real sense. There's no overarching master plan. The people who are writing the comics about Cable or about Deadpool or about Batman or about Superman are people trying to hit deadlines and pay their mortgage. And then it goes to an editor who may or not get something approved in the right way or may not have spoken to some other writer who they might have beef with in their bullpen. And so they might not have explained that, oh, you're writing a story where Superman's doing X, but actually we've got Superman, doing Y in this story at the same time. They're just people. There is no overarching Kevin Feige super powerful robot artificial intelligence putting all this sort of stuff together. It's a bunch of people just generally pulling in the same direction. There is no perfect solution. There is no mystery to solve by working out perfect chronology. That's why I just use what I refer to as headcanon, which is like canonical story in my head, continuity in my head. When I read stories, I'm just like, yeah, this is the Batman character roughly. So what's going on in this? Okay, cool, right. So this guy's Robin. Okay, cool. I'll just roll with it for now. And I have a general rough rule of thumb. Yeah, this roughly happens around about the same rough time as that. But there is no way to solve it perfectly. There is no mystery that I'm trying to uncover because there is no mastermind who's contrived a cleverly plotted, incredibly recondite story where everything is laden with Easter eggs and things go from line to line to line in terms of publishing and it all fits and slots together perfectly. That's not the case. A couple of authors might do that within their series. Grant Morrison might do that within a 12 issue run or something like that. But overarching like comics universe continuity, give me a fucking break. That's not a real thing. I get this a lot by people who get confused by bits of my new 52 reading guide. They'll say things like, "Oh, I'm reading Justice League: Throne of Atlantis, and I'm really confused as to whether I should read Aquaman first, or should I read Aquaman this and do that?" Or people that will be reading aspects of Robin War within my Batman part of that universe, and they're like, "Oh, well, do I have to read all of Nightwing first? And what part of what issue slots in with what part of what other?" It's like, dude, you have to relax. You just have to relax and just read it and just work out what you're comfortable doing. And the thing that I realized about those readers, and this is something which I can understand but I don't empathize with, is these are readers who are trying to get it absolutely perfectly right first time. These are people who are often saying, right, I want to read it, but I'm not going to read it until someone explains a reading order to me, and it has to be exact right. It has to be the perfect reading order. And I'll research it and make sure it's just right. And then once it's perfect, I'll jump in, and that way I have the perfect reading experience. You're not going to have the perfect reading experience first time. Like, that's not going to happen. For the same reason, you're not going to have the perfect viewing experience first time when you watch something. When you watch a movie like Unbreakable, that first time you watch it is unique. But the second time you watch it is so much richer. There's so much more that you see and so much more that you understand. So many Easter eggs and hints and foreshadowing that make it a richer and different narrative experience. Believe it or not, I'd use that same description for the MCU. You watch the phase 1, 2, and 3 of MCU, the good phases, and you get a great story. And then you go back and it's like, wow, this is fantastic. You're watching it, you're like, yeah, I'm watching it, but now I know what happens to Cap at the end. I know the importance of Loki's staff, and I know the importance of all these, various bits and pieces. It's great. It's like there's a foreshadowing. It sets up for the future. It's a richer experience the second time round. And that's what comics should be. You read it, you get it, you get a rough idea what it's like. You might read a whole bunch of Captain America comics, and then later on read a bunch of Hulk comics, and then later on read a bunch of events, and then read a bunch of Daredevil. And you go back to this Captain America comics, and you're like, oh shit, yeah, there's a lot more here than I'd realized first time round, but I just didn't know enough then. Comics should reward a second reading, books should reward a second reading, and films should reward a second watching, and the good ones do. The idea that you can nail it first time round and get an absolutely perfect reading experience, it makes me ask a question, which is, what are you reading comics for? Are you reading them to solve something or to tick a box? I'm not knocking that. I used to do that myself. Pump through one set of comics, pump through the next set of comics, make a reading guide, file them on my shelf, collect them a particular way. But more and more, I'll read them, and then occasionally I have to dip back in and I'll reread bits, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's really cool because of this other thing. You get more the second time round. And there is no perfect way to read it other than reading it and then reading it again and then understanding more about it. It's the same with movies. I remember watching Hot Fuzz, which is a great movie if you haven't seen it. But I watched Hot Fuzz, having seen Bad Boys and Bad Boys 2. You got to see Bad Boys 2. And then about a year later, I watched Point Break, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I see how that. Oh, I can see how Hot Fuzz is referencing Point Break." And then I went back and watched Hot Fuzz, and I was like, "Oh my god, this is so much better now." But it was great the first time. You shouldn't have to do homework to watch a movie like Hot Fuzz, but it's nice to watch it as part of this broader overarching narrative. And that really is where Type P and Type J readers, I guess, differ. Type P readers think there's something as overarching perfection that they need to aim for and get it chronologically perfect on day one. Type J readers, they just jump in and get wet. You can go a bit too far. You can be like, oh, hey, I'm a Type J reader. I'm going to read Black Widow issue 7, and then I'm going to read Hulk issue 9, and then I'm going to say, okay, there's There's being relaxed, and then there's just being an anarchist. Like there's a bit too much there. I'm somewhere in the middle, but I try to force myself to be more of a type J reader than a type P reader. I try to just enjoy something and not get bothered if I've read one particular miniseries that's I realize now I should have read before the preceding miniseries or so on. That happens all the time. You just got to just suck it up because the world's so big and there is no perfect result. I guess the last thing I'm going to say, and I'm sorry this video is so long, is just that one thing that I really don't like that type P readership can lead to is a kind of artificial gatekeeping. And this is when people say things like, "Oh, where's the perfect place to start reading Batman?" And someone's like, "Oh, well, obviously you've got to read issue 1 from New 52, and you start issue 1." And someone else, "Well, actually, before you read the New 52, you've got to understand the wider context of Batman, so you need to go back as far as Hush in the early 2000s. Actually, you should go back as far as Nightfall, but actually, you don't really understand the details of what happened in Nightfall until you go back to." And you get this weird regressive perspective of you got to go back to Detective Comics 27 back in 1930, whatever it was, 1939. Really, it's this idea of, oh, you need to understand everything before you can dive in the middle. Whereas that's absolutely not true. You can just jump in wherever you want, be it Superman, Batman, X-Men, jump in wherever you want, and you will not understand everything. You absolutely will not understand everything. But to say that you can't jump in the middle is like saying, yeah, you can't start watching a soap opera. You cannot. You're absolutely not allowed to watch a soap opera. You have to go back, way back to when the very first episode of the soap opera started 10 years ago, and you have to start watching it. You can't start now. That's absolutely not allowed. In a way, it's like saying you can't watch a movie. Oh, you're going to go to the cinema and watch John Wick. Well, frankly, you can't watch John Wick unless you've watched all the movies that it's referencing and all the clever subtleties about movies and cinema that you have to watch to understand it. You really should go far as back as Citizen Kane. Yeah, definitely, to really understand what cinema is. I know that sounds glib, but I do have a friend that refused to watch Kill Bill because Kill Bill, as a pair of movies by Quentin Tarantino, reference loads of other things. They've referenced loads of other martial arts movies and East Asian movies and kung fu movies and sort of blaxploitation movies. Is that the term? You know, the ones from that kind of grindhouse era of film. And he was like, "Well, I'm not going to watch Kill Bill because I won't appreciate any of that until I've watched all these other things." And so he basically gave himself homework of watching 80 other movies before he watched Kill Bill so he could appreciate Kill Bill. And I was like, dude, that is fucking bleak, isn't it? That's a horrible way to try and live your life. I watched Kill Bill. I got a lot of the references. I didn't get other ones. Just on Wikipedia later. I went out and watched a couple of those movies that he referenced subsequently, kind of like I did with Hot Fuzz, and that was fine. But the idea that you would gatekeep content, be it a movie or be it a comic or be it a video game, and say, you can't read that, you can't just jump in at issue 15 because you have to read all the previous issues, and then you have to read all the previous series, and then you have to understand the history of that. Nah, give me a break. Give me a break, man. I know loads about comics. I know absolutely loads about comics. There are maybe 5 people I've seen on the internet that know more about comics than I do. And I only started reading from the mid 90s. And those are the ones I care about. I'm not going back further than that. Don't care. Just don't care. It's about fun. It's not about solving something. It's not about being right. And it's not about showing other people that you know more. It's about just reading it, enjoying the story the way that it was meant by the authors, understanding their authorial intent, and having a good time with it. And not just the once, not just solving that comic and ticking that box and moving on, but coming back to it and enjoying it and reading it again and getting more out of it and just understanding roughly where it fits in. Slotting it all together in your head because you understand that there's no perfect internal chronology. That's not to say anything wrong with being a type P reader, that's fine, but never be too type P because it starts being bad for the comic community. So speaking as someone who's inveterately a bit of a type P reader, what I'm going to say is I always fight and push to make myself more of a type J. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.